come to the 29th presentation in this year of the Parayana. What we're accumulating is a pattern historically which gives us a kaleidoscopic view of the growth of civilization, important to us because the structuring dynamic of civilization is time in forms, so that time forms are the largest composition theme of civilization, which we now must really understand. Energy, if you can visualize it, moves in such a way that one can graph it and one gets a sine wave readout in technology of energy in its various kinds and types. It's rising energy into incredible power. It's sinusoidal wave signature will always have peaks and troughs that are symmetrical around an inner invisible line, a horizon, and that invisible horizon is time as the first dimension in its dynamic as energy in the universe, spontaneously occurring. And its spontaneous occurrence is such that what we can understand and detect, and finally, now through 21st century technology, come to appreciate from an insight at the beginnings of the 20th century, that all quanta of energy are discrete. They are discrete because they do not cause each other, they do not touch each other, though the, quote, space, distance between them is so minute that it's not measurable. And that fact is of great significance to a mature physics, in that time occurs before space. Thus it's a first dimension. And though space instantly blossoms, the instantliness comes from the dimension of time, which does not need a causality at all, but is spontaneously generated within a field that does not register at all, so that it's best to call it a zero field. Current 21st century speculation revolves around 0-point energy, and this is a misnomer, a misunderstanding. As early as 300 BC in Alexandria, Euclid, utilizing his Pythagorean background, was able to write a textbook on geometry called Plane, P-L-A-N-E, Plane Geometry, which is still used in high schools around the world. About the 10th grade, you're given geometry, and it works beautifully well. The very first language as a statement in Euclid's geometry is that a point is a locus of no dimensions, which moves. And when a locus of no dimensions moves, that means, without saying it, that time as a dimension has come into play. Because otherwise there would be no movement. What moves in a zero field? Time. So a locus of no dimensions moving describes a line. The Greek is very clear. Doesn't make a line. It describes, its movement describes a line. And that line can be given a starting point and an end point, but especially it's the dynamic within the field that it occurs that is able then to have a focus, and the focus is in a graphable space. And that four-dimensional space is a diagram that focuses on that center point of that line, which is the middle of its occurrence, and that line then can be said to begin there at that center, and one can then begin to describe that there is an end point to that line from that beginning, and that line will generate in its turn from point to line to plane. And this is the beginning of plane geometry, and from this one can construct an incredible array of mathematical and scientific themes that are good until this day and forever on, no matter where you are. Geometry will hold. There are many developments in it. But what occurs is that we have available a capacity which Euclid had to be able to write his geometry. He got it from the Pythagorean communities that were extremely powerful behind the scenes by that time for about 200 years. And it is that Pythagorean development that has sayings of Pythagoras that are preserved. The sayings of the living Pythagoras, as it were. And one of them is quite puzzling. They're given a listing in a 300s, 4th century AD life of Pythagoras by Iamblichus, Iamblichus. And one of the sayings of Pythagoras, and they're always prefaced by the Greek phrase ipsa dixit, he said, meaning this is testimony from the living source. He said, geometry is history. Meaning that history as time, as civilized time, has forms. It has a geometry. It can be understood. And that those understandings then are able to refine themselves so that the forms of history in their geometry, their geometricality, can be understood finally to be a science. Mathematics is the language of science because it has a geometry which is able to accept an algebra. And once one has something algebraic, the geometry itself evolves into a trigonometry, in which one begins to have the ability to have a geometry not just of plane geometry, but of vectors and of relational vectors that become tensors. And out of this, one can have an enormous development of mathematics and science. And indeed, we have done so. But what has not occurred, except for very few persons of great genius, or by communities of men and women who have learned together in those wonderful ways, but yet small communities, and only occasionally have had the opportunity to have an influence within that history of civilization. And those are the high water markers of the development of civilization to its possibilities, which are here now for us, with the proviso and the understanding that that possibility is time-form cued. And we live at a moment in history where the largest energy dynamic of time forms has just occurred about 1991. So large is this particular kind of time form occurrence that its appearance used to be called, in Pythagorean influenced eras, an age. That there is such a thing as an age, and an age is collectible into a pattern of ages, and the ancient understanding on a worldly level was that there were 4 ages. One can find them described in Ovid's Metamorphoses right at the beginnings, where he's talking about the dynamic of change, of transformation, of metamorphosing, in that the culture, the civilization he was writing in, the Roman Empire, recently established in his lifetime by Augustus Caesar. In the Roman Empire way, the great celebration of Augustus Caesar was that he was the beginning of a new age, an age of gold, where everything is renewed again. It's the fertile springtime of what will be capable of for the next currency of energy in the coming age, beginning with the age of gold. And that subset of that great age was 500-year periods. And the 500-year periods were cycles of the phoenix. The phoenix being not a mythical bird, but being a mystical marker of the way in which an age changes, and not just for a new age, but a new subset of the great age. That 500 years of a golden age has a natural built-in, because of nature, it has a kind of a decay. And after 500 years, the age of gold will give way to an age of something less than gold, a silver age. And that silver age will then have, towards the end of its 500-year period, after 1,000 years, it will reach a quality where the excellence of the golden and silver age begins to atrophy more, and one gets an age of copper. And that age of copper, then after 500 years, will initiate an age of iron, which will be so devastating and corrupt that at the end of its 500-year period, the entirety of civilization will be so corrupt that it will have to be redone initially, basically, by someone who institutes a new age of gold. All of this was a traditional understanding since the time of Augustus Caesar and was passed on constantly and continuously. And so in the late 20th century, groups that had formed in the 17th century, because in the 17th century was a time of another wave of time forms of civilization, not the carrier wave, the main one, but the forerunner of it, the reference wave. In physics, one always has to take a look at what is the reference to the carrier. These waves are related. In physics, in what used to be called metaphysics, but mostly in the understanding of civilizations. And in the 17th century, 1650, one had the reference wave, which we had in the late closing decade of the 20th century. And so that planning, all that time, resulted in a number of half-learned people who sought to use a standard of collecting and synthesizing and integrating and making sure that they had then the power at the needed node in the late 20th century to usher a new world order. This happened also in the previous set of 4 cycles of the Phoenix, 400 or 500 year periods, 2,000 years before. Because the Roman Empire also set itself up to take advantage of the reference wave then. Augustus Caesar understood. He was not a boy, hardly ever. And he was surrounded by the most powerful people of the age. He saw that the reference wave was the world conqueror Alexander the Great. And so his trigger cue of his moment to establish a new world order was to look for the place at which the reference wave had had its maturity at its high point. And for him, it resolved itself to Alexander's great city in Egypt, Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great. And so the whole movement of not just wise and cunning and conniving Augustus Caesar, but of this immense, all the power that one could have mustered at the time, was to take over Alexandria. And the cue for Augustus Caesar was that his uncle, once removed, Julius Caesar, had been involved in the most poignant of all of the power plays in Alexandria, in Egypt, with his relationship with Cleopatra. And so the whole devolvement of the prelude to Augustus Caesar declaring not only the Roman Empire, but something which was startling, and that is to build a temple, not to any god or goddess so much as to have that temple called the Ara Pacis Augustus, the temple of the permanent peace of Augustus of the Roman Empire. And we have talked about that a number of times. We're talking about it again and again because we are devastated now by a new world order that assumes that synthesizing and integrating, collecting together, coming together, tightening the pattern is the key to time forms, and that's not true at all. Not at all. Time is not dependent on what has been caused in space phenomenally, but what occurs spontaneously out of the zero field, which has its great symmetry and complementarity with an infinite field. In ancient Greek physics, that fifth dimension was sometimes called the ether. And one finds that same conviction not only in ancient Greco-Roman civilization, but in India as well. That there is an invisible dimension to the world, and that this invisible dimension of the world is the origin, sourcing, not the cause, of appearances, of phenomenal beings that convey the energy of time into space, and thus space-time has this quality of their movement in such a particular way. And one of the most startling of all of the figures in India who does this is Shiva. And Shiva does this because his movement is choreographed by eternity. And it is Shiva in that dynamic movement of a dance that is called Shiva Nataraja. And it is Shiva Nataraja who dances through the hoop, the flaming hoop of the portal out of which time's energy itself is going to be born, to be freshly, spontaneously here. And it is Shiva bringing this. But in the dance of Shiva Nataraja, he has to have an understanding with a feminine dancer who is equal to him in energy, equal to him in manifesting the power of time, the portals of civilization's energy nodes. And one of her names is Kali. In her destructive quality, that when corruption occurs, she has the power to destroy it, to destroy those who have that. She's incredibly not ugly, not evil, but powerful as a destroyer. And she enters into a dance contest with Shiva, who has as Shiva Nataraja, a 5-part, a quintessential choreography to his dancing. One of them certainly is emergence. One of them certainly is maintaining, sustaining. But the middle one of the 5 is destroying. And it is there, then, at the very pivotal core of Shiva Nataraja's own dance, in the third, the resolving third, the destroying of the old, the destroying of the corrupt. If the fourth and fifth, the rebirthing, the coming through, and the fifth, the eternalizing of it, are to occur, it's there in the destroying that he must win, not win over Kali, but win her acquiescence that rebirth can happen and that eternity can obtain again. In that dance contest, Kali matches Shiva movement for movement, genius for genius, power for power, and there is absolutely no difference between them in terms of capacity, in terms of energy. But Shiva has a movement in that third aspect of the dance of civilization, that he raises one of his legs enormously high up to the crown of his head, up to the area of the Saharastra chakra with his foot, and Kali, with her feminine quality of wanting to demur, exposing her genitalia in that way, will not follow that movement. And through that, she acquiesces to Shiva, not from losing the dance, not from having inferior energy, but for her preserving her femininity, which is preserved. And in the rebirthing, the femininity of Kali is one of the dominant, overseeing qualities of rebirth. It isn't Shiva winning who does it. It is Shiva coming to understand that he has been gifted with the dynamic, the energy, the time form energy of rebirthing, courtesy of Kali, who then has another form of her. And that form of her, in Greek lore, is Aphrodite. In ancient Mesopotamia, she became Ishtar, but before that, in Akkad, she was Inanna. And her story, her myth, her mythos, is commemorated as the work of the first known poet in the world, Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who founded the Akkadian great trade route. And she is also the priestess, the N-E-N priestess, the high real priestess of Inanna in Ur. The Ur of the Chaldeans, the Ur where Abraham was born, etc. But the Ur also of the quality that the power of the invisible dimension was not in Akkad, where Sargon was, where the king was, the king of kings, he was called. His name in ancient Akkadian, Sharukan, means the king of kings. In the Bible, he's called Sargon. She has brought all of the nodes of contact, all of the points of access to the power of divinity and brought them not in an integration, but brought them into a new pattern like a tapestry through her 42 temple hymns. And in that way, all of the facets have been brought not to a unity of something, but brought to facets of a jewel. Not a single jewel. And it's not the jewel so much. It's that the faceted quality of the jewel is able to show the full spectrum of possibility of what really carries the energy of the integral, and that is light. The whole spectrum, like a rainbow, but a rainbow of incredible numbers of colors. It is the color of phenomenality, the color of the world, the color of life, that she guarantees by her fertility, and not just a demureness that she will not wantonly expose her sexuality, but that she will hold it as the mystery of mysteries, as a visca piscis portal, which is stronger than circles, stronger than squares, stronger than rectangles and triangles, stronger than the geometry. The geometry of the mind, remember, begins with Euclid's Pythagorean understanding. A point is a locus of no dimensions. When it moves, it describes a line, and lines create then a plane. One of the first books that the Bauhaus used in the 1920s, after the First World War, was by Kandinsky. It's called Point to Line to Plane. Kandinsky and Paul Klee made the first textbooks, the first instruction books for the Bauhaus, to bring in a new sense of time-space, a new sense of color, a new language of creativity, using the creative imagination to begin not to teach so much, but to guide. A man will want to teach, a feminine will guide, will make that guiding. And it is this quality that in the early 21st century has its ultimate jeopardy now, and its best opportunity for rebirth. That's what this is about. All of this is about that. We're going to take a little break, but something about Aphrodite needs to be said, because she's like a key which we can grasp, which we can understand. It reads here, according to Hesiod's Theogony. Theogony is the study of the gods. Hesiod lived about 700 BC. He's often paired with Homer, whereas Homer lived several hundred years before Hesiod. Homer, born around 1000 BC, wrote his great epics in the early 900s, about the time that Makeda was writing the Song of Songs to Solomon. And David had written was writing his Psalms. They're very contemporaries. In fact, one of the great unheralded now scholars, Cyrus H. Gordon, named for Cyrus the Great. Homer and Bible, the origin and character of East Mediterranean literature, that one has to look at Homer and King David and King Solomon and the Song of Songs by Makeda as being contemporaneous with Homer. Not only his two great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also of his Homeric hymns to the gods, which are hymns, but when they're set into a larger composition, the correct word for them becomes an ode. And so the hymn odes are related like poems and prayers are related. The hymns are like the prayers, the ode like the poems. And they have a quality where one who can do both is called a poet-seer, a seer, a poet-seer. And a poet-seer is one who is able to come out of the vision into the art and reach back and bring the mythos through transformed symbols and give it in a new way through the visionary field along with the nature field into an art which is fertile to transform persons so that they then do not reproduce the old geometry of myths, but they develop the new possibilities of history. That's what we're doing. Let's take a break. Let's come back to this 29th presentation is dynamic of time forms and its particular wisdom relationship to the feminine. It's not a question at all of what is superior. It's a question of appreciating what is quintessential for life to occur. It must be born. It must have a beginning. It must have a way to pattern its development, to sustain it, to work with the inevitable limitations of phenomenality so that they can be not done away with, which would be a purely masculine solution. Let's make sure that we never get sick, never die. That's not life. So that the feminine births and sustains the maturation, not through planning, but through guiding and through the acquisition of the capacity for rebirthing, which has very often its trigger like the impregnation leading to a birth, to a masculine penetrative understanding, but with the feminine wisdom as further dimensions to this. In ancient Egypt, the figure that held this divine goddess quality was named Seshet. If you go to the web, S-E-S-H-A-T, and you will find a number of pages, and here she is. She is described as she who is the scribe, and here she is, she's inscribing on a royal staff. This royal staff is not the scepter of he who sits on the throne, but is the staff of the time limitations of his life. What he will be able to do if he accepts the guidance throughout the length which is here inscribed on the staff. But Seshet also is the one who, after that life has been lived, after whatever guidance has been accepted, he has then died and is going through the gates, the 12 gates of the netherworld. At each gate, he is challenged. The spirit is challenged, he or she. If there is a female king or emperor or pharaoh or whatever it is, each gate challenges with a riddle, with a challenge that cannot be resolved in terms of an integral. But like a koan, can only be lived with to emerge through. And she then inscribes the name of the person on a leaf of the Persea tree, a special rare species of laurel that is kept in the garden of Heliopolis in Egypt. And as she inscribes the name on the leaf of the Persea tree, Thoth, standing with her, inscribes his name in the registry book of eternity, whereas she inscribes his name on the eternal tree of life, the 2 trees of Eden, folks. If she does not inscribe his name on the tree of life, he cannot be reborn. Even if his name is inscribed on the book of eternity, rebirth is not possible. And because it's not possible, what is written in the book of eternity by Thoth will fade and eventually not be there. And in the ancient understanding of this, and I have included a classic page in the illustrations to our presentation notes, only those who are participating with this and through their kind participation and donations receive these notes. Observing Seshet writing the name on the laurel leaf of the Persea tree and Thoth writing the name in the tabulation of those in eternity is Osiris, the god of resurrection, who himself has only been possible to be the god of resurrection because only he has been resurrected by Isis, his lady. And not only Isis, but she collected all of the dismembered parts of Osiris by the arch red dog terrorist of the desert, Set, jealous that there should be an Osiris having an Isis and being supposedly one of the chief gods of reality, to cut him up. And the dismembered parts scattered all over the ancient Near East. It is Isis who went from place to place, finding part after part, and the only of the 14 parts she could not find to bring Osiris back together was his penis. And so she had made a penis out of a special wood. And her powers of life were able to put that together with the reassembled Osiris. And not only did his body come back into being as himself, but the penis that she creatively offered and made available was incorporated to the extent that he was able to impregnate her with a son, Horus, so that Horus is radiant like the sun rising, because he is the child not just of gods, but he is the child of, like Kali, acquiescing in the most genitalia, insightful, basic way that the male should be able to have the fertility, the love, the sustaining, to be able to have a child, in this case a son, with her. One of the recent publications gotten from me from the courtesy of my wonderful wife and researcher, Nisa, ordered for me, In Search of Cosmic Order, Selected Essays on Egypt and Archaeoastronomy, just published in Cairo by the American school there, and one of the great articles in here, one of the great contributions. In fact, the first one near the center is Unraveling Seshet, New Insights into the Stretching of the Cord Ceremony. Wonderful. What is the stretching of the cord? The cord is the basic teaching instrument of ancient geometry. Now you see that the preface of things is always like to fertilize a field. The ability to have a measurability so that one can understand phenomenality to such an extent that one can build a life or a building, an architecture, that only then, when one understands that there's an architecture to time, does one for the very first time begin to have the wake-up call, the idea birthed, the moment of thought, in Sanskrit a chitta, and in its higher dharma mode a bodhicitta, that this moment of thought, like a point of no dimensions, has movement. And the movement of a chitta, of the realization of a moment of thought, is like a Higgs boson coming into play, that one can condense even a vacuum and produce the ability for phenomenality not only to occur and emerge, but to have sustainability. Incredible sustainability. The proton has not lived out its lifetime of phenomenality yet. any proton that comes into play, as far as we know, indefinitely. Protons made at the beginning of the Big Bang, some 400,000 years after, are still here. The lifetime of a proton exceeds the life of the universe so far. So the sustainability is enormous, and the ability to have a cord, a stretching of the cord, the ability to have a measurement that is trustworthy to be held, not just to be beheld, but to be held, the possibility of an architecture of all levels and all kinds of things. Seshit guarantees this. Thoth, in his pairing with her, records that this indeed not only emerges, births, sustains, guides, but withstands the destructions of whatever kind, and comes through reborn, to pursue further through a higher sustaining, a higher guiding, a high dharma to achieve eternity. It's all true. Even now. Aphrodite, in mythology, according to Hesiod's Theogony, she was born when Kronos cut off Uranus's genitals and threw them into the sea. Kronos is time. Uranus is the sky. Time cut off the male genitalia of the sky and threw it into the sea. Uranus, shortened to the Latin Uranus, for which the planet Uranus is named. And there's a whole mathematical website of Uranos, etc. But Uranus was the son of Gaia, and it is a peculiarity that it was supposed to be Gaia, Earth, herself, who gave birth to her son. But actually the esoteric, the mystery, the Pythagorean understanding held all the way through was that Earth, Gaia, was able to be impregnated by the ether. And it was the ether, yes, invisible, so that one could say, like a wise but not a high dharma writer like Hesiod, like the Theogony. His other great work is called Works and Days. Yes, he was wonderful, but he wasn't high dharma. He didn't understand the mysteries of higher dimensions at all, like Homer understood. The ether gives a quality to Gaia's son, so that when Kronos cut off his genitalia and threw them into the sea, out of Gaia's supposed reach, the father, the ether, was able to work through the ocean and to make a daughter emerge from the ocean named Aphrodite. The Greek word for waves like that is aphros. Not just the waves, but the foaming of the waves. Meaning the waves foam when they're able to come into contact with land. Submerged sandbars or whatever it is, the shore. Large waves make really a lot of foam. And when they come up onto the sand, they hiss with all kinds of bubblings and froth and foam and so forth. Aphrodite was born of that foam, of the ether able to bring the impregnation into the waters, not just of the earth, but of the water, the oceans themselves. Botticelli's great Birth of Venus shows her coming ashore in a seashell. So powerful was the great Hermetic teaching given to Botticelli that the seashell is a recognizable ancient wisdom symbol. It's a very special kind of seashell. And there it is in Botticelli's painting, because Botticelli's teacher, Marsilio Ficino, in the High Dharma Renaissance, was not only the translator of Plato, all of his dialogues, all of his works, but the first translation into a modern language of the ancient Hermetica, just recently brought from the crumbling of Byzantium, falling to Mehmed the Conqueror after years of besieging the triple walls of Byzantium with cannon and the fleeing wisdom people with a few of the books. Always this happens. If somebody didn't save those books, Seshet's work as the writer not only of books but of the Tree of Life and the language of writing of Thoth, that the book is the interface of this wisdom. That seashell, take a look at Botticelli's painting, is the reward for pilgrims going on a quest. And they go on a quest that stretches about 250 miles from the Pyrenees down into northern Spain, across northern Spain, very close to the coast, to a small city that St. James went to in 41 AD. And it takes its name, St. James in Spanish, Santiago, but a special quality of St. James, a special quality of Santiago, del Compostela. St. James of the starry fields. All the starry fields. Not just a Uranus of the sky, but a Uranus of the whole heavens. The cosmos. And each successful pilgrim that makes that, and some 200,000 people a year still make that pilgrimage. They're awarded there in Santiago del Compostela the seashell. It's like the shell for the symbol, oddly enough, of shell oil. If you ever see the great comedy, Some Like It Hot, Billy Wilder with Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon and Marilyn Monroe. Tony Curtis bragging about his yacht and his wealth to Marilyn Monroe to have his way, says, our company has a monogram. And he holds up a seashell. Oh, I've heard of that, she says. It's this. You're hearing of the way in which, at the very same time that St. James left Jerusalem, he had tutored the young St. Mark from age 10 through his bar mitzvah, and saw that he was now a young man, not just a boy learning, but a young man ready for better guidance, and left him in charge of St. Peter, and went off to northern Spain, to what became Santiago de Compostela. At the very time he did that, the disciples of Jesus, Thomas and Matthew, set off together to go south and east, and Matthew accompanied St. Thomas, and St. Matthew went all the way down to Ethiopia. And St. Thomas went on further to India. St. Matthew went to Ethiopia because St. Philip had converted, through a direct transmission, the head of the great caravan that for 1,000 years had run between ancient Ethiopia, was not only in the African Ethiopia, but was in part of southern Arabian Peninsula known as Yemen. And those two together, that section of Ethiopia and section of Yemen, were known as Sheba. That's where the Queen of Sheba came from in Solomon's time. And in St. Philip's time, there was another queen in the lineage that was almost always masculine, and this time it was Queen Candace. And so, because Philip and Matthew and Thomas were the three, like a triad, like a triangle, who were meant to make the inscription, the Gospels, the record of what happened, Matthew, Thomas, and Philip, their Gospels make a triad. Matthew stayed in Ethiopia with the court of Queen Candace, and eventually died there. Thomas went on to India, in a special way, the South India, the Malabar coast, where all the Semitic Jewish traders were trading with Africa. Probably not trading in motorcycles. And northern India, where he went to King Gondophares, who had written a letter to Jesus, please send me an architect to build a palace in keeping with your teachings. I've heard wonderful things about you. Not just because he taught for 3 years in Palestine, but because he taught for over 30 years in Alexandria. And everybody in northern India who was of the Greek king lineage since Alexander the Great's time knew the truth about the wisest man in Alexandria for several decades was Jesus. And so Gondophares' letter reached Jesus, and he gave it to Thomas, who was an architect. He was from Damascus. And his architectural helper's name was Thaddeus. And later on, when it came time for the apostles, the disciples who were apostles, to go out and radiate the word, Thomas sent Thaddeus to the north to what has become the Armenians. And Thomas himself then went with Matthew down the Red Sea, all the way, Matthew to Ethiopia and he to southern Egypt, the Malabar coast, now called Kerala, that area, and then on by ship up to the northern part, the part which was then still identifiable as Gandhara, a part of in between Kashmir and Bactria, and it was that part that the Greek kingdoms had reached a high watermark of the normal elder's wisdom. One of the classics of late Buddhism, before there was a Mahayana, is the questions of King Milinda, which is a way in which the Indians pronounced Menander, Melinda. Most of the writings were in a southern version of Sanskrit, of Magadhi dialect of Sanskrit called Pali. And it's like a southern accent of Sanskrit, Melinda, Menander. And since the time of Megisthenes and so forth, Alexander's Greco-Buddhist empire there in northern India had reached out, like good Greeks, with all kinds of trade routes, and had reached all the way into Central Asia, had reached all the way down to the Malabar coast, all the way out, so that there was a whole pattern, even going around the tip of India and going up the Coromandel coast on the east coast of India. And there, along the Coromandel coast, archaeology has found in the late 20th century all kinds of Roman coins. And one of them is a very rare, expensive, golden Roman coin that has as its face the Roman Emperor Hadrian, with his full royal name, Hadrianus Augustus, the inheritor of Augustus Caesar, Hadrian, who was given that opportunity through Trajan, who reinstated the Roman Empire power after the great corruption of the Caesars and of the Flavians, had brought it back to what it became great for the next 100 years or so. That coin was minted about 125 AD. And that coin was not found on the coast, it was found inland, on the southern bank of the Krishna River at a place called Nargajuna Khanda. The Khanda in that South India dialect is hill, Nargajuna's hill, because one of the greatest of all the Mahayana high Dharma writers and figures was Nargajuna. And there was this huge outcropping of a rocky edifice coming up from a very fertile, beautiful valley. And that valley eventually, over several hundred years, became one of the biggest complexes of intelligence in the world, of central stupa, of viharas, of chaityas, and in that complex, the essential beginnings of it were designed by Nargajuna because he was also an architect. Many of these people were architects. Jesus' father, Joseph, was not just a carpenter. He was an architect. Could build anything. He had a source of trees in Lebanon because he was a partner in those forests. Really quite somebody. Where do you think the wood came from? We're talking about understanding context and patterning and depth, which is not anywhere available so that it can be understood. Not to teach, but to guide. Go and see for yourself. Check it out. Nagarjuna lived 100 years. He not only designed the beginnings of what became Nagarjuna Konda, became that great center, but down the Krishna River, big bend in the Krishna River, and if you went overland, it'd be about 70-some miles. He built what was the most powerful of all the Buddhist temples of the Mahayana. And it's called Amaravati. And he designed Amaravati in such a way that it was a high Dharma, gorgeous art transform of the great stupa that King Ashoka built in the very center of India at Sanchi. And the architecture of Sanchi is one of the treasures of the world. Sanchi not only is a great stupa, but it has 4 triple column torii-like gates, Torana. And they face the 4 directions. And those 4 directions with that kind of a stupa quality are exactly what one finds in the stupas and the chaityas, like at Ajanta that we talked about last week. And we'll talk about more. But when one begins to understand the architecture, of architects, of civilization has an architecture to it. And one needs to understand that if one is going to rebirth civilization. Because everything that was there is corrupted beyond saving. And it will have the same career that Homer says the dead have. When they go to the fields of asphodel, the Hades, they begin to fade and fade and fade and fade. And eventually they will fade away. Their death is not that someone killed them, it's that their own inability to sustain themselves or anything else fades from view and finally evaporates. They don't need to be fought and killed. They will evaporate. They have no power of staying. They have no life. When Circe tells Odysseus how to interview the fallen dead in Hades and how to come back out, he's to take a bowl of blood. They look for blood. Blood through violence, blood through rape, blood through whatever it is, in order to sustain and stop their fading for a while. Dante in the Inferno, with his guide Virgil, sees the interminable, closed, little lemming-like qualities of those whose corruption is that they cannot stop themselves. That's evil. More next week.